So this is the 11 a.m. talk on the blue track. So this is a fun story. It's about spies. It's about hunting dead drops, C2 communications, and also about malware, right? So it's going to be fun. Let's welcome Jonathan Fuller. It's his first time at BSidesNYC City, so let's welcome him.
Good morning. Good morning. My name's, like you said, Jonathan Fuller. I'm the CISO at the United States Military Academy. If you were in the John Hammond keynote, you might have a sour taste in your mouth about service academies, but it's not that bad. He had a rough go, maybe. I also moonlight as an assistant professor in the electrical engineering computer science department. Not really moonlighting. I'm just dual-hatted. But I get to do fun stuff in forensics and malware analysis, and I'm really excited to get to share some of that with you today. So this talk is about modern spycraft and how attackers hide their content in everyday web applications. So this work began years ago when we were looking at botnet takedowns, and we were trying to figure out ways to make that a bit easier. And what we found inside malware kind of change how we think about botnet takedown. So without further ado, let's start with the problem. So as many of you know, botnet takedowns and disruptions, it's pretty tricky, right? It almost feels like beheading Hydra. You cut off one head and two more emerge. You often hear about botnet resurgence or ineffective counteraction techniques, and the cycle just continues to grow and grow. So really in practice, it's hard for investigators, it's hard for defenders to have full access to the CNC infrastructure, including victims, malware, proxies, servers. It's really difficult to get a hold of the entire CNC infrastructure for a more comprehensive investigation towards botnet disruption and takedowns. As a result, those investigations often take time. Even if they don't take time, like I said, they're just lacking all the information they need. But in that time, the adversaries are able to migrate CNC servers. They're able to cover their tracks. A lot could happen that would reduce the effectiveness of botnet disruption and takedown. So before we dive further, let's just look at why botnet disruptions and takedowns are kind of an arduous process, at least many of the current practices, right? So there are four main milestones to botnet disruptions and takedowns, beginning with the discovery of a botnet that's sufficiently large to warrant a response. You're not going to burn all your resources and assets on something small. You're going to invest resources in sufficiently large botnets that may affect SCADA systems or enterprises or governmental resources. So we begin with the discovery of a botnet and determining that it's sufficiently large to warrant a response. Next, we begin to monitor that botnet. We'll profile it to understand the scope of the infection, to collect information used for counteraction, to understand the types of malware that creates bots, and get information from there. And then based on that profiling, we'll start developing techniques and our response capabilities in order to pursue botnet counteraction. Right after we counteract that botnet, or at least pursue some type of disruption, then we're going to monitor. We just want to validate the efficacy of our approach to understand the resulting scope, right? How many devices are still infected? Did we wipe this out completely? Where do we stand? And as an example, after discovering TrickBot in 2016, Microsoft realized the scope of infection and decided to proceed with counteraction against TrickBot. So TrickBot grew close to half a decade, and Microsoft decided to get involved. There may have been some issues with an election interference around 2020, so this became quite a hot topic, and TrickBot was kind of a global spread incident. So to profile TrickBot, Microsoft collected over 100,000 malware samples. They analyzed them to find mapping information, to understand the communication routines, to understand their locale, and they found 128 servers around the world. And so after profiling, they developed counteraction techniques, understood who the stakeholders were that they could work with. Using this information, they required a collaborative effort with international organizations, and they pursued counteraction to disable TrickBot servers around the world. So they continued to monitor the TrickBot botnet. They identified that they were able to disrupt or take down 120 of the 128 servers, and then they continued to monitor other avenues for disruption. Of note, most of those 8 servers were hosted in bulletproof hosting providers. You just don't have jurisdiction sometimes. You can't get to them. But it's a lengthy process, right? So we wondered, are there more efficient ways or effective ways to disrupt botnets? Right. I'm not saying I'm better than Microsoft here or international organizations, but we're just trying to understand the art of the possible. Are we able to push the needle a little bit further to create opportunities for organizations to pursue more effective botnet counteraction? And so how did we get from botnet counteraction to, we're heading to Spycraft 2.0 in a bit, but just so we understand this a little bit more, we began examining the malware itself and how each bot actually communicates with the CNC server. Not unlike most botnet takedown techniques, but we decided to focus more so on that malware versus servers and proxies and other artifacts that made up the CNC infrastructure. This is a malware analysis project only. And so we identified that bots already know how to authenticate themselves to the CNC server. They already know how to communicate. They contain all the information we need. We just really need to know how to look and what to look for. And so tracing that logic within malware, their communication routines, we realized that as defenders, as investigators, we could potentially repurpose logic within the malware for our own use. Is there some weakness inherent in that logic that we can exploit? And this insight changed everything, right? This led to our first major discovery. So we'll dive into that a bit. So bots are the trusted end host agents of a command and control server. In fact, attackers are entirely dependent upon information exfiltrated by victim systems to gain situational awareness into a victim's network. And oftentimes, bots use standard protocols for file transfer, for data storage, for message-based communication. And many of these protocols, though, are over-permissioned, right? That means that they provide feature-rich or unfettered access into a CNC server beyond a subset of features implemented by a given client, right? So for instance, if I'm using a protocol that does push-pull, but my malware just requires it to do push, like I'm doing password stealing, if they're using the entire protocol and I'm able to take advantage of that, then I can do push and pull, even though the malware doesn't implement that full push and pull feature. In fact, here's a list of common over-permission protocols in use today. This list was derived a lot from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? We dug in, looked at some of their blogs and posts and understood what malware often uses, and then we pulled this list together, really sourced from industry and academic experts. Now, we wondered if we could exploit this knowledge to use against the botnets. All right, so let's look at a quick example of covert infiltration of CNC servers. So to demonstrate, we're going to use a deplock malware to kind of give you an understanding, a more practical understanding of how we're able to exploit these over-permission protocols in malware. If you've never heard of that term, over-permission, I'm pretty sure I made it up and it's not a real thing. So just humor me here. So we first analyzed the deplock malware and discovered its use of the over-permission file transfer protocol. You might wonder, why is anyone using file transfer protocol? It's known to be insecure, but attackers often prefer efficiency and ease of use over a security of their botnet. Right now, the more sophisticated your attackers get, the more sophisticated techniques would be used, but essentially you find the lowest cost effort so that you can maximize your ROI. So we found that FTP and a couple of these other over-permission protocols are quite commonly used, even though they're well-known insecurities. So we analyzed the deplock malware, discover the use of the file transfer protocol, and then we look for something called infiltration vectors, right? Infiltration vectors that's a Defender term, right? So the malware has FTP credentials baked in. They're obfuscated, so it requires some dynamic analysis so that you could populate memory locations for extracted, but they're obfuscated, they're baked in, and if we can recover these credentials, we could use them as infiltration vectors, right, from the Defender standpoint to infiltrate that CNC server. However, if you just infiltrate a CNC server, right, you could act as under the guise of a trusted bot. You're establishing similar communication routines that a malware would, but you don't want to just kick the door open. I picture that Kool-Aid man from the commercial when he breaks through the wall. You don't want to do that to a CNC server. You want to be a little bit more stealthy. So we identify CNC monitoring capabilities. Really, those are just malware capabilities that give you insight into what's on that CNC server. So instead of like, doing a find dot all and pulling everything, you can more intelligently search through a CNC server, knowing what to look for. So if malware does live monitoring capabilities and screen capture, what do you think you're going to find on that CNC server? Maybe some images, some PNG files. That's what we mean by CNC monitoring capabilities. So we do some capability analysis, find live monitoring, victim profiling, file exfiltration. Then we use that infiltration vector to get into the botnet. And then we use the file monitoring capabilities to do some active monitoring, right? We poke around in a more intelligent fashion rather than just flip all the tables over in furniture. And we identified some PNG files confirming live monitoring capability, and we found some other malicious files, which means that the CNC server was probably used as a dropper at some point. I want to couch this all in ethical research, right? There's some things we can do and some things we can't do. So we didn't pull any files off the server, nor tortious interference as it would be called, because that's illegal, right? While this software was flagged as malicious on VirusTotal, it could also be a mom and pop shop hosting a server that was exploited and used for malicious actions. So this technique, while valuable, would be used by those with legal authority to pursue actual botnet counteraction. So this technique gives us the ability to do peer disclosure. We could find other infected systems on the network. We could dismantle the botnet that way. We could shut down the CNC server or blacklist it. And all this is cool, but it's kind of old news. This is not the main aim of the talk. The point is just to show our foray into using malware to counteract botnets, right? That was our initial goal, to try to answer that first question that I proposed to you guys. This was presented at ShmooCon, Georgia Tech, and AvengerCon. You could look up C3PO is actually the name of the framework. What's it stand for? Covert Command and Control, something of over permission protocol infiltration. I don't remember the name of it. That's what C3PO stands for. But if you're interested, you're welcome to look it up. There's lots of details about C3PO and how we did this at scale, and we're able to find some pretty cool things. So why do we care about malware logic reuse in the first place? Well, we talked about that a little bit, right? To create more opportunities for defenders to efficiently, effectively disrupt botnets. So we know malware already knows how to communicate, how to authenticate, how to hide, and instead of just analyzing the malware and its behavior, we can reuse what that malware is already doing. So we took the FTP logic, we found it within the DepLock malware, we found the exact connections, the infiltration vectors, the CNC monitoring capabilities, and we use it to access a CNC server. So we flipped the script, right? The very logic the adversary built to control victims became our tool against that adversary. And that's the whole the heart of this work, right? We want to turn the malware's capabilities against themselves, which I meant to mention. Once in a while, people have to get up to leave, and I had this thought that whoever gets up in this talk is probably a malicious actor and is really offended. So just so you know, we're all watching. But yeah, what does this have to do with Spycraft? So during our analysis, there was an unexpected finding, right? We're looking at over-permission protocols, but not every malware uses an over-permission protocol, right? You guys know they're ransomware, they're crypto miners, XYZ, they're across the board. And we discovered something interesting, a malware that wasn't first connecting to its CNC server, but a malware that was connecting to Twitter. And this obviously caught our attention. We know that some malware will establish will test internet connection. If I have internet, continue the attack, else sleep for 360 seconds or something, right? So it's not uncommon for malware to contact benign sources. And oftentimes it'll just throw you off your track, right? If you're just doing PCAP analysis per se, and you're looking at overlapping communication routines and network flows, it can confuse a defender. Obviously, if you throw more advanced defenders there, they might be able to piece it out, but low-hanging fruit. Use FTP, do a bunch of benign connections, throw a defender off, make him annoyed, and so we kind of piqued our interest, though. Why Twitter? And was this a one-off, or was this the start of a new kind of malware tradecraft, right? Was it Spycraft 2.0, like the new version, where malware, it's hiding its communication in plain sight? So as you'll notice at the top right, MITRE has I think, what do you call it, a threat ID or capability ID with respect to dead drop resolver. So around the time of our study, MITRE posted this on their website, and there's a bunch of other reports of dead drop resolvers out there. So this is emerging technology. Really, when you think about why would a malware author want to do this, right? Well, if you've heard of fast flux networks or domain generation algorithms, there are all these dynamic command and control resolution techniques that attackers are using in order to more covertly access their CNC server. Well, we know with fast flux networks, you can do block listing really easily. Domain generation algorithms, if you have control of the malware, you could extract the DGA algorithm, you could reverse engineer it, and then you could forecast all future possible CNC domain names and block list them ahead of time, so you're effectively dismantling the entire CNC infrastructure. So that's why DDR, or this approach, dead drop resolvers, come into play. Malware authors are always looking for the next best thing to evade detection, to seem more benign than they actually are. And so if they are relying on Twitter, on benign web applications and websites for access to their command and control servers, can we leverage this to counteract those botnets, right? They are effectively taking some control and they're handing it over to a web app. Granted, it's very hard to find, it can be obfuscated, but when malware authors hand over any bit of control, that's our opportunity to kind of pounce on that and try to use that malware logic, reuse that malware logic for counteraction. So a dead drop, if you're not familiar with a dead drop, any of you guys familiar with this park? Does anyone know? Yeah, wow, okay. That's suspicious that you know what this is. There should be none. No. So there was a FBI agent, Richard Hansen, back in 2001. He was caught. I think they paid $7 million to a Russian double agent to find the mole in the FBI, and based on fingerprints and other sorts of tracking, they identified Richard Hansen, who for almost a decade has been handing top secret information over to the Russians. One piece of information, right? The Russians had an embassy in DC, and the U.S. was kind of, wanted to keep an eye on, so they bought a house across the street and started to dig a big tunnel under. Am I getting this right? I could be making it up. You never know. Only one guy would know anyway. Robert Hansen, not Richard. Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry to whoever is Richard Hansen. I apologize. Robert Hansen, right? Dug a tunnel. The U.S. was trying to surveil Russia, and he gave out a bunch of information. Well, he would go to this park, use a chalk to mark on the sign, walk into the park. He would have some files wrapped in a black trash bag, and he would tape it underneath of a bridge. This was his dead drop and the marking where his Russian handler would come in, grab the files, and leave. So this is Spycraft 1.0. All right, this is what dead drops are in effect. Now, dead drop resolvers, they're the digital equivalent of hiding those files under the bridge, and they're public web applications like Twitter, like Pastebin, GitHub. They're used by malicious actors to hide command and control server information in plain sight. And so once a system's infected, it connects to one of these dead drops. They'll retrieve the command and control server. It's oftentimes encoded. And then the malware goes ahead and retrieves that information. It decodes that message layer by layer to reveal the true IP or URL for the CNC server before establishing that final connection, right? This technique has all the hallmarks of a classic spycraft, right? Classic spy incident, an endless supply of public channels or public parks, granting the attacker both anonymity and elasticity, right? So much to choose from. And you could create an account without really verifying yourself. DDRs also enable unlimited, unpredictable endpoints, each one disposable, each one easily replaced. The traffic itself looks harmless. Ordinary HTTPS traffic requests a legitimate sites, making this technique kind of hard to observe. It's often indistinguishable from normal user activity, right? Enterprises can't do blanket restrictions on Twitter and GitHub. You just can't block all that traffic. You could maybe be more concerned about the subsequent outbound connection to a CNC server, but really triaging this to the full extent, it's kind of tricky without understanding what this malicious software is doing. And then the messages themselves are multi-layered, right? You can't just brute force these most of the time to understand what's behind that encoded content on the web app, right? And lastly, this is a purview future down the road, right? This specific malware sample does exist. This Twitter handle is still up. Sorry, it's gone. I guess I could show you if you want to check it out. You could go to Twitter and I think still find it, because we submitted a request to Twitter with some evidence saying, hey, you found this malware. It's talking to this account. Can you please take it down? And their response was like, if you find this offensive, please block the account, which doesn't necessarily get there. But it is hard to counteract DDR malware for instances like this, right? Did you have a question? No.
If I'm running a platform like that can possibly be abused, so I actually run a master instance, what do you think is a good strategy for platforms to actually identify?
We'll get there. Good question. I didn't plant that question, by the way. Good question. So, like I said, these traits make DDR malware nearly invisible. And what we're trying to do now, what I'm trying to convey is our ability to turn that visibility back on, right? To understand what's happening in this digital world of Spycraft. So how do we stop DDR malware, right? This question led to 3 key insights. And the first is DDR samples must decode that CNC address for use. Thus, the malware has that decoding logic baked within, right? And if we understand how the malware's demanipulation logic, that's their decoding or decryption logic, if we can understand how that works, then maybe we can extract that logic, do some platform scanning to your question, and identify similarly encoded content, revealing CNC IPs or URLs, and using something like VirusTotal or URL host to understand the scale of maliciousness. Maybe we can do something like that. So this first insight was a breakthrough. We were like, oh man, this will be cool if we could figure this out. But when we tried to operationalize this idea, it was quite tricky, right? Malware samples don't always make their DDR routines obvious. Malware authors may prefer efficiency of ease and use, but they're not dumb, right? They want to add some complexity to their malware to prevent immediate triage and response by investigators. So many malware connect to multiple domains, producing really a tangle of network connections. And then even if we're able to confirm which routine in the malware performed the decoding, they're often in mathematical representations in code. This is compiled code, not source code, right? And if those are interleaved with network flows within your communication routines, it makes it pretty tricky to just extract this routine. It's not a plug and play. It's not a Control-C, Control-V approach. So this challenge spawned from our first key insight led us to 2 additional key insights. So imagine investigators observing network connections to web apps, followed by another connection. If you want to identify the DDR logic, we realized that we could localize DDR routines based on content fetching and content use, right? So profiling the specific place that the malware connects to that web app and then tracking that information flow throughout the malware. But even if we isolate that logic, how do we know what specific algorithms are being used? So the little red dots in there, right? That's a representation of the logic. If we can isolate that, that doesn't really tell us much unless we know what specific algorithms were used and in what order. Which led to our third key insight, which is the demanipulation routines. If you're using symbolic execution, which maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but they reduce to symbolic expressions, which they're just arithmetic and logic operations in an expression. If you know anything about symbolic expression or symbolic execution, you're just mutating branch predicates as you explore a malware, and you're just doing the converse of what maybe that concrete value to do branch traversal would be. So it creates an expression saying, A is greater than 2, go left. If A is less than 2, go right. And as it traverses branches, it continues to add logical operations. So now A is less than 2, B is greater than 3, and it starts building this expression for you to traverse one path versus another. So if it reduces the symbolic expressions, can we take these symbolic expressions and match them to known algorithms to find demanipulation recipes? So we take a known algorithm like base64, we create a symbolic expression, then we take the symbolic expression from the malware, and then we compare them. And we say, do they reduce to the same thing? If so, they're the same algorithm. And let's look at this with the MudDrop malware example. We're going to look at a macro level, and I think we have time to deep dive into the micro level as well to understand how this framework analyzes DDR malware and extracts these recipes. Remember, the goal is we could identify the DDR malware. That's a great step. We identify it, we email Twitter, and we say, hey, take this down. They say no. We email Pastebin, and they're like, yep, we'll do it for you. Different web apps respond differently. But in either case, it's a win. We got a post taken down. How can we take this a step further, right? And that's why we want to extract these demanipulation recipes so that we can use them for proactive dead drop discovery. We want to multiply our efforts. So our framework takes the MudDrop malware, which is a known DDR malware. I'm using it kind of our running example to illustrate the efficacy of this approach. So our framework takes the MudDrop and it does DDR logic localization. Remember, that wants to take some path within the binary and understand where is that DDR connection and capability happening. Normally, this happens right at the beginning of malware execution. David, in the last talk, he mentioned, how do you decode PowerShell script? And someone on a Reddit posted, you run it, right? Well, in malware analysis, they're often packed and obfuscated. What is a great way to unpack or deobfuscate malware? You run it and set a breakpoint. And a normal breakpoint is the first network connection. That's a great breakpoint. So if you dynamically run malware, set a breakpoint at like an internet open A or WinHTTP open or SOC open, that's a great breakpoint where the malware is likely deobfuscated itself, unpacked itself, and it's ready to execute the rest of the payload. So DDR logic localization normally happens right after the unpack, right at the beginning of malware execution. And so we will look for the logic localization in order to extract those routines and then match them, right? In this case, in this running example, the DDR logic showed that the malware connected to a WordPress and it retrieved this dead drop content, just a random string of characters. Then we have to do the demanipulation boundary isolation. It's just a fancy way to say it connects to Twitter and it does the decoding or demanipulation, and then it connects to the CNC server. We have to localize that logic. We find a boundary. And then we'll go to the micro level first. So micro level, how does it do this? It uses concolic analysis. So concolic analysis is the portmanteau for concolic execution and symbolic analysis. Really, you're running the malware concretely to populate environment variables or different concrete variables. But as we know, if you run malware concretely, it'll take one path. If you don't have the proper environment variable set, it might go straight to exit, right? Or it might not take the path you want, and you won't get full malware exploration. So we use symbolic execution in order to trick the malware to go down paths we want. For this, we use a framework called S2E, You could use Anger plus Symbion if you want to do it a little differently. There are many frameworks that you can do concolic analysis with, but in this case we use S2E. So we execute the malware, we identify the DDR candidate where it first connects, and then we note that, okay, this connects to a web app. You could use Trainco, which is a research product that provides you a hardened list of known good websites. So we use Trainco, we compare our first connection with a known good list of web apps. If it's one of those, we continue execution, all right? Trainco, Tranco. It's based on some research. They just have so you can go on and download new list all the time. But yeah, it's a great resource. So it'll connect to WordPress, and then it will read from WordPress, right? So up to this point, there's some concrete execution happening, but you'll see a little bit about where the symbolic execution is occurring. So when it reads data from WordPress, we want to inject symbolic data there. We want to tell the malware that here's the real data from WordPress, but really we're smuggling in data that we can track the information flow throughout. So that's called, you could call it constraint or concolic taint propagation. You could just call it symbolic tagging. There's many different terms for it. But we hide some data into the memory buffer that's supposed to contain the information retrieved from WordPress. So whether WordPress is alive or not doesn't really matter. We're faking it till we make it, right? We're injecting data to induce exploration. And so that exploration induces M lambda is just our representation for that symbolic expression. We tagged it with symtag1, and that data is flowing through the malware. And eventually, there's going to be a subsequent outbound connection. So we'll track another Internet Connect A. And if the target within Internet Connect A has our symtag, then we know, oh, okay, that's the information that it read from WordPress, and it uses that to establish a subsequent outbound connection. That's how we identify DDR capabilities, right? Initially connect to a web app, use that data to establish a subsequent outbound connection equals DDR malware. And then somewhere within that, that's where we find the demanipulation boundaries. Decoding has to occur somewhere in there. To go from a random string of data to a 188.93 whatever IP address, some demanipulation logic has to be within there. So we were going to use that demanipulation boundary to kind of pull out those algorithms for further study. So next we do the demanipulation recipe identification. We have the boundary. Now we identify the recipes. In this case, the recipe is base 16 and character rotation, and that gives us that CNC IP address, right? So this is kind of what it looks like. You have the dead drop content, and then you apply base 16 decoding, and then character rotation, and then you get the final CNC server address. So we've confirmed it's a DDR malware, right? But how do we actually pull out those demanipulation recipes? So we have two pseudo implementations of decoding in malware. The source code isn't fully accurate. It's shortened for brevity. As you'll notice, my rotate character for function, I made that up, and there's no code attached to it. So don't Google it. But as you'll notice here on the left side, lines 3 through 5 are kind of a character rotate, and then the other line shown here, 6 through 8, table lookup for base 16. And then on the right side, that's just what a different version of base 16 looks like. So how do we show that both versions of base 16 are the same algorithm? Imagine the one on the left is from a malware sample, and the one on the right is from our known version of base 16. We don't know how the malware author implements base 16. We don't. We know how you can implement it. The input reduces in the same output for base 16, right? So we have two different implementations that we want to understand equivalency. And so essentially we have the evaluation of what data means. So on the left side, data initially contains that dead drop content, right? It's read. I could barely see on my screen too, so I hope you can see that. But yeah, Internet Connect A goes out to WordPress. Internet read file reads the dead drop into the data field. And so data at line 2 contains that decoded content. at line 5 as it's being decoded, and then at line 9 when it's fully decoded. Same thing on the right. Line 2 is the encoded content, and line 6, because it's just doing base 16, it decodes it to the CNC server, right? Now, if we inject symbolic data, you remember we're going to do some symbolic expression matching. We're going to extract symbolic expressions from the malware and then known symbolic expressions and try to do some matching. Let's see if this works, right? We have lambda 1 and lambda 2. This is what a symbolic expression looks like. Remember, it's arithmetic and logical operations. It's just a series of mathematical operations expressing how the execution got to that point in time. How can you replicate that same execution path? You would solve the symbolic constraint, and it would give you values to plug into if statements. If this, go right, and it would just help you traverse down that binary. So if we compare these together, are they equal? Well, character rotation happens initially, and base 16 decoding on the other side. So on the left side, it's a combination of both. So they're definitely not equal. You're comparing one symbolic expression that contains multiple decoders to a symbolic expression that is purely base 16. They will not reduce to the same values. So that won't work. So we need to localize the base 16 decoding in order to properly compare it. And while their characters are different, right? One's using a table lookup versus straight mathematical inline computations, they reduce to the same value if they're indeed equal. And so let's go through a little example. As we're executing through this malware, we will halt execution when the malware accesses any value containing lambda or that symbolic data. This is built into our framework. It'll just halt execution, and it will extract that information, concretize that information, and go to work with it. So in this case, it's executing. It halts at line 2 because lambda data was marked with lambda and data is red, so it halts and it says what's in that, or what's in the data field, concretize it, and it does that. It changes it to a concrete value. It solves that symbolic equation, and it says it's 1, 2, 3. Good. Now I want you to take 1, 2, 3 and use it as input for a set of known decoding algorithms that we have. I'll show you, I think it's like 15 of them or 14 of them. It'll submit them as input, and it'll track the output. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, as you see on the top right corner, outputs to 5, 6, 7, 8, ABCE and ABCF, depending on the decoder under evaluation. We'll continue executing the malware, and it will halt again at line 5 when data is again accessed, and it will ask, what is the value of data? Data is 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, if you'll notice, 5, 6, 7, 8 was the output of the character rotate algorithm. So this then tells us that between lines 2 and line 5 is where character rotate occurred. It'll continue this process, and it'll repeat it, and then it will localize the character rotate, and it will localize the base 16 algorithm based on their input to output domain mapping. This is how that boundary is isolated. And now, instead of comparing the entire symbolic expression from the malware to our known algorithms, it will allow us to more correctly, we're now comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So compare those expressions, and you will find equality amongst them. And that's how we do it. So we take every expression, we localize them, and then we start comparing them with our known symbolic expressions. And that results in our extraction of our recipe using concolic analysis, providing us a scalable approach to analyze DDR malware and extract recipes. Based on those recipes, we can perform recipe scanning, right? We scan web app platforms and network traffic, web app platforms for information. Obviously, we're limited by being throttled. You can only crawl so much. But as a proof of concept, we show effectiveness of this approach. And then after we're able to identify recipes, scan web apps, we can proactively identify dead drops for remediation. In this case, from this one dead drop on the left of the screen, the bottom left, we're able to identify 3 previously unknown dead drops. So the dead drops found on the right, I didn't have malware samples for those. We scan the WordPress platform using our recipe, and we identify other similarly encoded content. And then we submitted the resulting CNC addresses. We didn't know that at the time. We submitted those to VirusTotal, URL hosts to understand their maliciousness, and then those are the results reported there. And we deployed this on 100,000 malware samples captured over a decade. Like I mentioned, this concac analysis provided us a scalable approach to do this. If you know anything about concac analysis, it would blow up your computer if it runs too long. So we set about a 15-minute timer. Some we just couldn't analyze for unresolved symbolic constraints. The symbolic expressions were just too hard to resolve. We just couldn't do it. And here are some large-scale findings, right? So 100,000 malware samples, we found maybe 9% of DDR malware in our data set, 7 unique web apps, and we found Pastebin to be the most prominent use web app. So we know that Pastebin has long been used for malicious purposes, right? You could host droppers on there, you could host scripts. It's always been a go-to for malicious use, but this is probably one of the first works to expose its pervasiveness to host dead drops. Next, we identify several blockchain explorers. So this is pretty cool, right? Blockchains are immutable. You can't take something down, right? So this is a really robust way to host CNC addresses. You could request help from blockchain hosting providers, right? They host. You could go to their website, and I'll show an example of that. But they host transactions. You could request that they remove their hosting of the transactions, but blockchains are immutable. So once they're up, they're up. And we found about 25% of our DDR malware in our data set use these blockchain explorers. They often share wallet IDs, so there are multiple connections. They might try one connection to a transaction ID or wallet ID, and if that doesn't work, they just try a different website that hosts the same transactions. Here's an example of what one looks like, and this is still live because you can't take it down, right? So it uses the 2 recent transactions, which are normally a couple cents, 43 cents, 53 cents, and then it converts those to IP addresses, and that's what the malware uses to connect to its CNC server. Now, what's cool about this, though, if you have access, which all of us do, I could go and I could post 2 new transactions to this wallet, and then I could sinkhole the CNC server or take it out. There was a study done for pony coordinated malware where they did this exact same thing. They were able to post new transactions and temporarily sinkhole that CNC server. So all new malware will connect to your CNC server versus the actual CNC server. But then the attackers can just post new transactions and it goes back and forth. So this would probably get annoying for attackers over time. But if you have time, you should do it. We also found 3 dynamically generated Twitter accounts, which is kind of weird, right? We talked about DGA algorithms and how they're kind of the old thing. We move on to DDRs because DGA algorithms are susceptible to reverse engineering, allowing you to predict all future candidate domains for a disruption. But we found some samples of DDR malware that achieved a hybrid approach. So they had a DGA algorithm inside to randomly generate Twitter accounts, register them, and use them for CNC server dynamic resolution. But as we know, DGA techniques still apply for counteraction. We can reverse and we can pre-request blocking of these based on evidence that we have. This was an interesting finding. And then a bunch of known, really well-known web apps. We wondered if malware authors don't use these because it just, they've been studied quite a bit. There's a paper, Marcia, that really deep dives into more holistic use of web apps for command and control infrastructures. So we wonder if things like that make malware authors less likely to use really popular web apps or well-known web apps. And for time's sake, I'll move through some of this faster, but what we also did, instead of just scanning web apps, we also used a NetResec PCAP data set that they provided us, and we scanned this entire data set just to look at traffic to see if we could identify any indications of DDR malware, leveraging our recipes to scan content presented within those PCAP files. And we identified 72 new dead drops hosted across 11 web apps. And not surprisingly, base64 is kind of a go-to. You even saw it in David's talk when we're talking about PowerShell obfuscation. Base64 is always used. It's even used in normal benign network traffic because it helps ensure data maintains integrity as it's being transmitted. But base64 is a go-to. And so you might wonder, why can't we just brute force everything? Just brute force everything with base64. Well, it's because 60% of those you'll see that are not base64 actually. The remaining 60% use multi-layered approaches, so brute forcing really is not a tractable approach. From another perspective, we already also found 67 hidden CNC servers, which means that based on the numbers, attackers have just been reusing the same CNC servers and just re-encoding them across web app platforms. And what does this tell us really? That web app providers struggle to identify dead drops on their platforms, right? And it also illustrates a bit of importance and shows the impact of our approach. We can see that 60% of dead drops that are used to protect CNC servers still remain available during this time of study. Let me wrap up here shortly. And so from the NetResec dataset, we were able to request remediation and successfully remediated 80% of those dead drops, which affects all the malware that rely on them. So real-world impact, we move beyond reaction, right? We try to remediate dead drop resolvers and CNC servers before they ever go live. Our large-scale study and the findings, right? Those provide helpful and help us to understand the scope of this issue. We improved detection by 57%, and we're able to work with web app providers, some of whom positively responded to take down posts from their web apps in order to remove hosted CNC servers. And then the best part, it's a scalable defense. We enabled web app providers to detect and remediate threats early. So malware logic reuse is a thing, right? You can reuse logic within malware or attempt to provide opportunities for counteraction or disruption of botnets. Attackers evolve, right? They try to blend in better, and we need to study this malware, not to just gain an understanding of what they're doing, to post a blog about it, but to just gain some intelligence for counteraction. So studying malware is not just about understanding the threat, but learning how to turn what the attackers use against themselves. And then Spycraft 2.0 shows that the best defense may be inside the adversary's own code. And if you're interested in learning more about Spycraft 2.0, there's a paper published this month, a few days ago, that takes you into full details. There's some code available. There's a ton of artifacts, how I test our robustness of symbolic expression comparison. Please feel free to go out, take a read, and if you're interested in learning more, happy to connect and shoot me a message. I'm happy to respond. We got maybe 2 minutes for questions.
So your recipes had pre-baked ciphers and coding methods. Did you see any indications of custom or slightly tweaked ciphers or coding methods?
Yeah, those are tricky, right? So I may not have shown a list. I might have skipped over it, but we have a list of like known decoders, and we just comb through MITRE, other research papers, and we're like, what are attackers normally going to use? We even have some ways to identify encryption in the paper. We use something called constraints, like constraint solving, where we just track constraints through encryption APIs to extract the key and use it. We didn't find many of those, but yeah, that's definitely a limitation. Rolling your own encryption or decoding would be tricky because you can't match them to any known. Yeah, great question. No, we didn't see it. I'm sure it exists. Just like when I talked about the overpermission protocol, not all of them are overpermission. We identified some DDR. Not all of them are DDR. There's probably some good techniques. I was talking to the volunteer running this classroom, and he was mentioning identifying some malicious steganography attacks in his threat intel work. So yeah, they're definitely out there.
You mentioned the example you brought in, future and
Yeah, that's a tough question, right? They have to weigh freedom of expression with trying to remove malicious actions, right? And there's only so much you can do. So we wanted to provide this resource as a mechanism for web app providers to understand that they are armed to do this if they choose to do it. So you could scan platforms. They already do that, right? In the paper, we have an entire sections about how web app providers are already scanning for child sexual abuse content and other like malicious content on their platforms. The scanning is already happening. You can just extend it to identify malicious artifacts and IOCs from botnets. All right, thank you guys for your time. I think we're done, but I'm happy to talk offline if you guys have any questions. So yeah, thank you again for your time.